The bronze bells of Lindisfarne Monastery ring across waters that have known only peace, their measured cadence marking the hours of a world soon to be transformed. In this late 8th century, the North Sea stretches like a protective moat between civilizations, its grey expanse seemingly infinite, separating the Christian kingdoms of Britain from the mysterious fjords of Scandinavia. The sound of these bells carries across stone corridors where monks bend over illuminated manuscripts, their quills scratching eternal truths into vellum that will outlast the kingdoms they serve. This is the world before the storm, a delicate equilibrium of isolated communities, each believing themselves secure within their geographic boundaries. The monastery stands as more than a religious institution. It represents the crystallization of early medieval civilization, a place where Latin learning mingles with Celtic spirituality, where the written word preserves the accumulated wisdom of centuries. In scriptorium chambers lit by flickering tallow candles, brother scribes illuminate the margins of gospels with intricate knotwork that mirrors the complexity of their faith, never imagining that these very treasures will soon attract predators from beyond the northern horizon. The rhythms of monastic life reflect a broader European pattern of settlement and consolidation. Across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, wooden halls echo with the voices of Scots who sing of heroes long dead. Beowulf grappling with monsters, Arthur drawing swords from stones. These are stories that celebrate the triumph of civilization over chaos, of Christian virtue over pagan darkness, yet they carry within them an unconscious prophecy of the trials to come. The very monsters they celebrate defeating will soon assume new forms, emerging not from mere halls but from the dragon-proud vessels of a people who have learned to make the sea their highway. Charlemagne's empire expands across the continent with the inexorable logic of imperial administration, its bureaucratic machinery grinding forward with unprecedented efficiency. The Frankish court at Aachen represents the apex of early medieval achievement, a synthesis of Roman administrative tradition, Germanic warrior culture, and Christian theological sophistication. Yet even this mighty empire, stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, remains fundamentally terrestrial in its conception, its armies marching along Roman roads, its authority extending only as far as mounted messengers can carry imperial decrees. The isolation of these Christian communities is not merely geographic, but conceptual. Their world is bounded by familiar horizons, their maps decorated with dragons and angels at the edges of known geography. The sea represents not opportunity but barrier, not highway but wall. When storms arise, they pray for deliverance. When ships appear on the horizon, they assume kinship or commerce. The possibility that the very waters they trust for protection might become the avenue of their transformation lies beyond their imaginative boundaries. Yet across those northern waters, changes are stirring that will reshape the European world. In the fjords of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, a different relationship with the sea has evolved over generations. Here, the boundary between land and water is not sharp but fluid, carved by glacial forces into landscapes that demand maritime adaptation. The harsh beauty of these northern realms, mountains that plunge directly into dark waters, valleys accessible only by boat, winters that lock the land in ice for months, has created a culture uniquely adapted to oceanic existence. The population pressures building in these Scandinavian heartlands remain invisible to the monks copying manuscripts at Lindisfarne, yet they represent forces as inexorable as tidal movement. Limited arable land supports growing populations, creating a demographic mathematics that will soon demand expansion. The social structures emerging in these northern kingdoms, the thing assemblies where free men debate under open sky, the warrior bands bound by oaths of loyalty, the intricate gift exchange networks that maintain peace between competing chieftains, represent alternative models of organization that will challenge the assumptions of Christian Europe. The technological innovations taking shape in Nordic shipyards embody a revolution in human mobility. The longship, with its shallow draft and symmetrical design, represents more than improved transportation. It embodies a fundamental reimagining of the relationship between human communities and geographic space. These vessels, capable of navigating both open seas and shallow rivers, will transform the very concept of frontier, making every coastline a potential gateway, every river mouth a highway to the interior. The old gods of the north watch over these developments with patient eyes. Odin the Wanderer, Thor the Protector, Freya the Provider, deities who embody the values of a society balanced between earth and sea, between settled agriculture and nomadic exploration. Their mythology celebrates not the triumph of civilization over chaos, but the eternal struggle between order and entropy, the heroic acceptance of fate, the warrior's willingness to face inevitable doom with courage and style. These are not the comfortable pieties of monastic Christianity, but the harsh wisdom of a people who have learned to thrive in the world's most demanding environments. The convergence of these forces, demographic pressure, technological innovation, cultural values that celebrate expansion and risk-taking, creates a historical moment pregnant with transformation. The year 793 approaches like a tide that will reshape every shore it touches, yet the monks of Lindisfarne continue their daily routines, their bells marking time in a world that it leaves itself eternal, their candles flickering in stone chambers that seem as permanent as the cliffs on which they stand. The North Sea itself becomes a character in this unfolding drama, its waters carrying more than ships and cargo. It bears the seeds of cultural exchange, the potential for synthesis between different ways of understanding human existence. The very waves that will soon bring violence also carry the possibility of new forms of art, new systems of law, new ways of organizing society that will enrich the medieval world in ways that none of its contemporary observers could anticipate. In these final years of the 8th century, Europe stands at a threshold it does not recognize. The comfortable certainties of geographic isolation, the protective boundaries of sea and mountain, the reassuring rhythms of monastic bells, all these will soon be tested by forces that understand no boundaries save those imposed by human ambition and courage. The storm that will reshape the medieval world is gathering in the north, its winds carrying the salt scent of change across waters that have known only peace. The dragon ships are being built, their oak timbers cut from forests that have never known the sound of church bells, their iron nails forged by smiths who honor different gods. Soon these vessels will slice through morning mist with predatory grace, their crews carrying not just weapons, but entire alternative visions of what human society might become. The world of the monastery bell and the illuminated manuscript is about to encounter the world of the Thing assembly and the warrior's oath, and from this collision will emerge the dynamic tension that will drive medieval European development for the next 3 centuries. But for now, in these last quiet years before the storm, the bells of Lindisfarne continue their ancient rhythm, marking time in a world that believes itself permanent, their bronze voices carrying across waters that seem to promise only peace, their sound a benediction over a civilization that has forgotten that all human achievements are temporary, all boundaries permeable, all certainties subject to the transformative power of human ambition and the relentless movement of historical time. The morning of June 8, 793, dawns over Lindisfarne with the deceptive serenity that precedes historical cataclysm. The tidal pools reflect a sky unmarked by portent, while monastery bells summon the faithful to lauds with their familiar bronze voices. In the scriptorium, Brother Higbald illuminates the margin of St. Matthew's Gospel with intricate Celtic spirals, his steady hand guided by generations of monastic tradition. The treasury holds its accumulated wealth, silver chalices that have blessed countless communions, gold-worked crosses that embody divine protection, illuminated manuscripts that preserve the accumulated wisdom of centuries. By Vespers, these sacred objects will be scattered across bloodied sand, their meaning transformed from symbols of divine benediction to tokens of mortal vulnerability. The longships emerge from the morning haze like manifestations of collective nightmare, their dragon-headed prows cutting through water with predatory grace. Yet these are not the mindless barbarians of later imagination, but skilled navigators executing a strategy of devastating precision. The 30 oars of each vessel move in perfect synchronization, propelled by men who understand the psychological dimensions of their assault as clearly as its material objectives. They have chosen their target with calculated deliberation, not merely for its wealth, but for its symbolic resonance, its capacity to send shockwaves through the interconnected networks of medieval Christendom. The raiders who pour from these vessels represent the convergence of multiple historical forces. They are the products of demographic pressure in their northern homelands, where limited arable land has created a generation for whom expansion represents not opportunity but necessity. They are the inheritors of technological innovation, the revolutionary ship design that has transformed the North Sea from barrier to highway, the superior metallurgy that gives their weapons deadly efficiency, the navigational knowledge that allows them to strike with surgical precision. Most significantly, they are the bearers of alternative cultural values that view the accumulation of portable wealth not as avarice but as practical wisdom, that celebrate mobility over rootedness, that honor courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The assault itself unfolds with horrifying efficiency. The monks, trained in the contemplative arts rather than martial resistance, offer no organized defense. Their worldview contains no category for this form of violence. Sacred space violated, religious authority ignored, divine protection apparently withdrawn. The raiders move through the monastery complex with purposeful determination, seeking not random destruction, but specific forms of valuable portable goods. Silver is stripped from altar furnishings, gold peeled from manuscript covers, precious stones pried from reliquaries. The violence is instrumental rather than gratuitous, yet its psychological impact transcends its material dimensions. Brother Higbald's gospel, its illuminated margins still wet with gold leaf, becomes inadvertent witness to transformation. The raiders examine these manuscripts not with the reverence of believers, but with the calculating eye of merchants, weighing the value of precious metals against the inconvenience of transport. Some books are preserved for their material worth, others abandoned as worthless. The irony cuts deep. Texts that preserve divine revelation reduced to the crude mathematics of weight and portability. Yet even this casual assessment contains recognition of value, an unconscious acknowledgement that these northern warriors operate within cosmopolitan frameworks of worth that extend far beyond their supposed barbarism. The psychological earthquake that follows the Lindisfarne raid reverberates through the scholarly networks of early medieval Europe. Alcuin of York, writing from Charlemagne's court to King Athelred of Northumbria, captures the civilizational shock in prose that trembles with genuine terror. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race, nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made. His letter becomes more than correspondence. It represents the literate world's attempt to comprehend the incomprehensible, to fit unprecedented violence into familiar categories of understanding. The raid's reverberations extend beyond immediate shock to fundamental questions about divine providence and secular protection. If God's house could be violated, if sacred objects could be profaned without immediate divine retribution, what did this suggest about the cosmic order that medieval Christianity claimed to represent? The comfortable assumptions of geographic security, of spiritual protection, of civilizational superiority suddenly appeared fragile before the demonstration of superior mobility and military efficiency. Yet the raiders' perspective reveals different calculations entirely. For them, this assault represents not sacrilege, but opportunity, the application of proven techniques to unexploited resources. Their worldview contains no reverence for Christian sacred space, no recognition of monastic immunity from violence. They operate within alternative frameworks of honor and obligation that celebrate successful risk-taking, that view the accumulation of wealth through force as legitimate expression of masculine virtue, that understand reputation as the most valuable form of property. The systematic expansion of such raids across the next generation reveals strategic sophistication that contradicts stereotypes of me. Endless violence. Rathlin Island falls in 795, its Irish monastery suffering the same swift devastation that had befallen Lindisfarne. Iona, the spiritual heart of Celtic Christianity, endures repeated assaults that systematically strip away its accumulated treasures. The pattern emerges clearly. These are not random attacks, but calculated exploitation of a discovered vulnerability. The systematic mining of accumulated wealth from communities that had never imagined the need for military defense. The technological foundation of this expansion rests upon the revolutionary characteristics of Nordic shipbuilding. The longship represents more than improved transportation. It embodies a fundamental reimagining of the relationship between human communities and geographic space. With its shallow draft and symmetrical design, the vessel can navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, making every coastline a potential point of attack, every waterway a highway into the continental interior. The ship's ability to be carried overland between river systems transforms the entire hydrographic network of Europe into a single, interconnected transportation system, accessible to those who understand its possibilities. The cultural implications of these early raids extend far beyond their immediate material impact. They introduce into European consciousness alternative models of social organization, different conceptions of legitimate authority, contrasting approaches to the relationship between individual achievement and collective obligation. The raiders bring with them not merely weapons and ships, but entire worldviews that challenge fundamental assumptions about how human societies should be structured and governed. The transformation of European defensive consciousness begins almost immediately. Communities that had relied upon geographic isolation suddenly confront the reality of their vulnerability. Coastal monasteries begin to relocate their treasures inland, while secular authorities grapple with the military implications of enemies who can strike anywhere accessible to water. The comfortable medieval distinction between frontier and interior dissolves before the demonstration that mobility can transform any coastline into a potential battlefield. Yet even as these raids traumatize their immediate victims, they set in motion processes of cultural exchange that will ultimately enrich the medieval world in ways that contemporary observers could not anticipate. The silver that flows northward to Scandinavian treasuries will return as trade goods, supporting commercial networks that connect the Arctic to the Mediterranean. The slaves taken in these early raids will become cultural intermediaries, carrying skills and knowledge between different societies. The very violence that appears so destructive will ultimately contribute to the creation of new forms of cultural synthesis. The ravens that feast upon the aftermath of these raids become symbols of transformation rather than mere destruction. In Norse mythology, these birds serve Odin as collectors of information from across the world, their flight patterns mapping the networks of knowledge and opportunity that connect distant human communities. The raven's shadow that falls across Lindisfarne on that June morning in 793 marks not merely the end of an age of innocence, but the beginning of an age of connection, violent perhaps, but pregnant with possibilities that neither raider nor victim could yet imagine. As the dragon ships disappear beyond the horizon, carrying their stolen treasures back to northern harbours, they leave behind more than devastation. They leave questions that will reshape European intellectual life, challenges that will drive innovation in military technology and political organization, and the dawning recognition that the medieval world is far more interconnected, far more vulnerable, and far more capable of transformation than anyone had previously understood. The age of the Vikings has begun, and with it, a new chapter in the long story of human adaptation, expansion, and cultural evolution. To comprehend the Viking expansion, one must first understand the profound environmental mathematics that governed Scandinavian existence. The fjords that cradle these northern communities represent landscapes of breathtaking beauty and ruthless limitation, carved by glacial forces into configurations that demand maritime adaptation. Here, arable land exists in precious fragments between mountain and sea, supporting populations that grow inexorably toward the boundaries of ecological sustainability. The harsh magnificence of these northern realms, peaks that plunge directly into dark waters, valleys accessible only by boat, winters that lock the land in ice for months, has created cultures uniquely adapted to oceanic existence, societies that understand the sea not as barrier but as pathway, not as boundary but as opportunity. The social architecture that emerges from these environmental constraints reflects a sophisticated understanding of how human communities can organize themselves for both survival and expansion. The tripartite division of Norse society, jarls who command wealth and warriors, carls who work the land and sail the ships, thralls who provide the labor that makes surplus possible, represents not mere hierarchy, but functional specialization, adapted to the demands of a society that must balance agricultural production with maritime venture. This is a civilization that has learned to extract maximum efficiency from minimal resources, where social mobility remains possible through individual achievement, but where collective survival depends upon the maintenance of complex reciprocal obligations. The institution of the thing, the assembly of free men that serves as both court and parliament, embodies democratic traditions that predate the monarchical systems these Vikings will eventually challenge. In outdoor amphitheatres carved into hillsides beneath open ski, that serves as roof for proceedings that recognize no earthly authority as absolute, decisions are reached through debate and consensus that will profoundly influence the governance of lands not yet discovered. These assemblies represent more than political expedience. They embody cosmological understanding that views legitimate authority as emerging from the collective wisdom of free men rather than the divine mandate of hereditary rulers. The religious worldview that shapes Norse consciousness reflects the complex relationship between cosmic order and human agency that characterizes societies, balanced between settlement and mobility. The pantheon of northern gods, Odin the Wanderer, Thor the Protector, Freya the Provider, Freyja the Sorceress, embodies values that celebrate not the triumph of civilization over chaos, but the heroic engagement with forces that can never be completely controlled. This is a mythology that prepares its adherents for expansion rather than entrenchment, that honors risk-taking over security, that understands wisdom as something to be actively pursued rather than passively received. The surprising agency exercised by women in Norse society reflects the practical necessities of communities where male absence through trading, raiding, or warfare demands female competence in all aspects of social and economic management. The Shield Maiden represents not fantasy, but functional adaptation, the recognition that survival in demanding environments requires the full utilization of human resources regardless of gender. More routinely, Viking women manage estates, negotiate commercial agreements, initiate divorce proceedings, and inherit property in patterns that contrast sharply with the more restrictive gender roles characteristic of contemporary Christian societies. The technological innovations that make Viking expansion possible represent convergent solutions to the fundamental challenge of how human communities can extend their reach beyond immediate geographic boundaries. The Longship embodies revolutionary advances in hydrodynamic design, construction techniques, and navigational capability that transform the relationship between human societies and aquatic environments. These vessels, with their shallow draft and symmetrical configuration, can navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, making accessible vast networks of waterways that had previously served as barriers rather than highways. The ship's ability to be carried overland between river systems effectively transforms the entire hydrographic network of northern Europe into a single interconnected transportation system. The metallurgical expertise that produces superior weapons and tools reflects sophisticated understanding of ironworking techniques that surpass contemporary European standards. Viking smiths develop methods for creating pattern-welded blades that combine hardness with flexibility, producing weapons that serve not merely as instruments of violence, but as works of art that embody the cultural values of societies that view craftsmanship as a form of spiritual expression. The elaborate decoration of these weapons, silver inlay, runic inscriptions, mythological imagery, transforms practical tools into symbols of identity and status that carry meaning far beyond their immediate functional applications. The warrior ethos that drives Viking expansion cannot be dismissed as mere glorification of violence, but must be understood as a comprehensive philosophy that addresses fundamental questions about how individuals should relate to mortality, community, and cosmic purpose. The concept of Valhalla represents not primitive superstition, but sophisticated psychological preparation for the risks inherent in expansion beyond familiar boundaries. The belief that heroic death in battle guarantees admission to Odin's Hall creates cultural mechanisms that encourage individual courage while serving collective strategic objectives. This is a society that has learned to channel potentially destructive masculine energies toward productive purposes of exploration, trade, and territorial expansion. The early settlement patterns that begin to emerge during this period reveal strategic sophistication that contradicts stereotypes of random wandering. The occupation of the Orkney and Shetland Islands represents not mere conquest, but calculated positioning, the establishment of forward bases that can support further expansion while maintaining communication with Scandinavian heartlands. These island communities become laboratories for the development of hybrid cultures that blend Norse traditions with local practices, creating new forms of social organization that will prove adaptable to the varied environments that Viking expansion will encounter. The emergence of specialized trading centers reflects the development of economic strategies that complement and eventually supersede pure raiding. Communities like Hedeby in Denmark and Birka in Sweden become cosmopolitan entrepôts where goods flow between the Baltic and the North Sea, where silver from the Islamic world mingles with amber from northern forests, where Byzantine silk encounters Arctic furs. These commercial centers represent more than economic nodes. They become cultural laboratories where different traditions of craftsmanship, artistic expression, and social organization cross-fertilize to produce innovations that will enrich the broader medieval world. The linguistic diversity that characterizes Scandinavian societies reflects both regional variation and the cultural adaptability that will prove crucial to Viking success in foreign environments. Old Norse serves as a lingua franca that facilitates communication across tribal boundaries, while regional dialects preserve local traditions and identities. This linguistic flexibility prepares Viking communities for the challenges of operating in multilingual environments, where success often depends upon the ability to communicate with diverse populations speaking Celtic, Slavic, Romance, and Germanic languages. The religious syncretism that begins to emerge during this period foreshadows the cultural adaptability that will characterize Viking expansion. While maintaining devotion to traditional gods, Norse communities demonstrate remarkable willingness to incorporate foreign religious practices when they prove useful. This theological flexibility reflects practical wisdom rather than spiritual confusion, the recognition that divine favor might manifest through multiple channels, that foreign gods might possess powers worth cultivating, that religious exclusivity might constitute a strategic disadvantage in cosmopolitan environments. The demographic pressures that drive expansion cannot be understood solely in terms of population growth, but must be viewed within the context of social systems that create incentives for mobility and risk-taking. The inheritance patterns that typically favor eldest sons create cohorts of younger men with limited prospects for advancement within traditional structures. The warrior band institution provides these men with alternative pathways to wealth and status through collective enterprise beyond tribal boundaries. The gift exchange networks that maintain peace between competing chieftains create demand for exotic goods that can only be obtained through long-distance trading relationships. The seasonal rhythms that govern Scandinavian life create temporal windows that facilitate long-distance expeditions. The agricultural calendar provides periods when male labor is not essential for immediate survival, while ice conditions and wind patterns create optimal conditions for oceanic travel. The cultural celebration of these seasonal transitions, the festivals that mark the passage from winter to summer, from harvest to planning, provides ritual frameworks that transform potentially disruptive departures into community-sanctioned enterprises blessed by divine favor and collective support. As these various forces converge during the middle decades of the 9th century, they create conditions that will transform the Viking Age from episodic raiding to systematic expansion. The technological capabilities, social institutions, cultural values, and demographic pressures that characterize Norse societies represent evolutionary adaptations that prepare these communities for roles they cannot yet imagine, as founders of cities, creators of trade networks, synthesizers of cultures, and bridge builders between the ancient and medieval worlds. The great heathen army arrives in England like a geological force, its very nomenclature suggesting something beyond ordinary military expedition. This is not merely a raiding party, but a migration of peoples seeking new homelands, a demographic avalanche that will permanently alter the political geography of Anglo-Saxon Britain. The army's leadership represents a convergence of legendary figures: Ivar the Boneless, whose tactical brilliance compensates for physical limitations; Halfdan, whose administrative genius transforms conquest into governance; Ubba, whose maritime expertise ensures continuous communication with Scandinavian homelands. These are not the savage chieftains of popular imagination, but sophisticated strategists executing campaigns of remarkable complexity and scope. Their systematic conquest of East Anglia, Northumbria, and portions of Mercia reveals military sophistication that challenges contemporary European standards. The army moves with disciplined precision, establishing fortified camps that serve both defensive and administrative purposes. Their siege techniques demonstrate familiarity with continental military engineering, while their diplomatic negotiations reveal understanding of Anglo-Saxon political dynamics that could only come from extensive intelligence networks. The establishment of the Danelaw represents more than territorial conquest. It embodies the creation of alternative governmental structures that will influence English legal development for centuries. Simultaneously, other dragon ships follow different currents of opportunity across the medieval world. Dublin's transformation from modest Irish settlement to major Viking city exemplifies the urbanization processes that accompany Norse expansion. The harbour fills with vessels carrying slaves from Scotland, silver from the Islamic world, amber from Baltic shores, and furs from Rus, Scion forests. The city becomes a cosmopolitan entrepot where Nordic, Celtic, and continental European traditions synthesize to create new forms of artistic expression, architectural innovation, and commercial practice. The Hiberno-Norse culture that emerges represents neither Viking nor Irish, but something entirely novel, a hybrid civilization that demonstrates the creative potential inherent in cultural collision. The Varangian route opens like a golden thread through the Russian river systems, connecting the Baltic to the Black Sea through networks of portage and navigation that transform Eastern Europe into a single integrated commercial zone. Swedish Vikings, adapting their maritime expertise to riverine environments, established trading posts that will grow into cities: Kiev, Novgorod, Smolensk, each representing a synthesis of Scandinavian organizational capacity, with Slavic agricultural productivity and Byzantine commercial sophistication. The route becomes more than a trade network. It evolves into a cultural transmission system that carries technologies, artistic styles, religious concepts, and governmental innovations across vast distances. The Siege of Paris in 885–886 demonstrates Viking adaptation to continental warfare, revealing tactical flexibility that contradicts stereotypes of mindless aggression. The Norse forces, led by Sigfred and Rollo, employ sophisticated siege techniques, including the construction of elaborate fortifications that effectively surround the Frankish capital. Their negotiations with Charles the Fat reveal diplomatic sophistication and strategic patience that transform what begins as military expedition into political opportunity. The eventual settlement that grants Normandy to Rollo represents a paradigmatic example of Viking transformation from raiders to rulers, from destroyers to builders of new forms of medieval civilization. The evolution from raiders to traders reflects fundamental changes in Viking strategic thinking and European defensive capabilities. As coastal communities develop more effective resistance mechanisms, Norse expeditions increasingly emphasize commercial opportunities over military conquest. The transformation of York, Kiev, and Dublin into major commercial centers reveals Viking capacity for urban administration and commercial innovation. These cities become laboratories for the development of new forms of medieval governance that blend Scandinavian democratic traditions with the administrative requirements of diverse urban populations. Intermarriage and cultural synthesis produce new identities that transcend simple ethnic categories. The children of Norse settlers and local women grow up speaking multiple languages, practicing syncretic religious traditions, and inheriting claims to multiple cultural heritages. These hybrid populations become crucial intermediaries in the broader processes of European cultural integration, serving as translators not merely of languages, but of entire worldviews. The Danelaw's legal traditions, which blend Anglo-Saxon and Nordic customs, provide models for legal pluralism that will influence European jurisprudence for centuries. The expansion of Viking commercial networks creates unprecedented connections between previously isolated economic zones. Scandinavian merchants establish trading relationships that link the Arctic to the Mediterranean, carrying goods and ideas across distances that challenge contemporary understanding of geographic possibility. The flow of Islamic silver northward through Russian rivers, Byzantine silk westward through Baltic ports, and Arctic ivory southward through continental markets creates commercial relationships that make the Viking Age a crucial period in the development of global economic integration. The technological innovations that facilitate this expansion represent collective achievements that surpass individual genius. The development of specialized ship designs for different environments, ocean-going vessels for Atlantic crossings, shallow draft boats for river navigation, cargo ships for bulk transport, demonstrates systematic adaptation to diverse geographic challenges. The refinement of navigational techniques, including the use of crystal sunstones for celestial navigation and detailed mental maps of coastal features, enables oceanic voyages that push beyond the boundaries of known geography. The cultural transformations that accompany territorial expansion reveal the creative potential inherent in the collision between different civilizational traditions. Norse artistic styles blend with Celtic decorative motifs to produce new forms of metalwork and manuscript illumination. Scandinavian storytelling traditions adapt to incorporate local legends and historical narratives, creating hybrid literary forms that preserve multiple cultural perspectives within single narrative frameworks. Religious practices evolve through contact with Christianity, producing syncretic beliefs that maintain traditional cosmological understanding while incorporating new theological concepts. The demographic impact of Viking expansion extends far beyond the immediate regions of settlement, creating population movements that reshape the genetic and cultural landscape of medieval Europe. The transport of slaves from Celtic regions to Scandinavian markets, the movement of Scandinavian settlers to conquered territories, and the circulation of merchants and craftsmen throughout expanding commercial networks produce mixing of populations that increases cultural diversity while facilitating technological and ideological exchange. As the 9th century draws to its close, the Viking expansion has fundamentally altered the political, economic, and cultural landscape of medieval Europe. What began as opportunistic raids has evolved into systematic colonization that creates new cities, establishes alternative governmental structures, and demonstrates the creative potential inherent in the collision between different civilizational traditions. The foundations have been laid for achievements that will define the zenith of Viking ambition: the discovery of new continents, the creation of unprecedented democratic institutions, and the synthesis of cultural traditions that will enrich European civilization for centuries to come. Eric the Red's exile becomes the catalyst for humanity's most audacious maritime expansion, transforming personal misfortune into collective triumph that pushes the boundaries of human geographic possibility. His departure from Iceland in 982, fleeing the consequences of feudal violence, initiates a process of discovery that will establish European presence in lands so remote they strain contemporary understanding of navigational achievement. Greenland, ironically named to attract settlers to shores more forbidding than welcoming, represents the ultimate expression of Nordic ambition, a colonial venture that tests human adaptability against environmental challenges of unprecedented severity. The Greenlandic settlements that emerge from this expansion embody human resilience in its most concentrated form. Eastern and Western settlements, separated by hundreds of miles of Arctic wilderness, develop subsistence strategies that blend Scandinavian agricultural traditions with innovative adaptations to subarctic environments. The settlers learn to exploit marine resources, seal hunting, walrus harvesting, whale processing, that provide not merely sustenance, but commercial goods valuable enough to maintain tenuous connections with European markets. Walrus ivory becomes Greenland's primary export, its quality rivaling elephant ivory from African sources, while Arctic furs command premium prices in continental markets that value rarity and exotic origin. The social structures that develop in these remote settlements reveal remarkable continuity with Scandinavian traditions, despite environmental pressures that might be expected to produce authoritarian responses to survival challenges. The Althing tradition transplants successfully to Greenlandic conditions, creating governance mechanisms that maintain democratic participation even in communities isolated from broader European polis. Political developments, the preservation of legal traditions, cultural practices, and religious observances demonstrates the power of institutional memory to maintain civilizational continuity across vast geographic distances and extreme environmental conditions. The Icelandic Commonwealth emerges simultaneously as perhaps the most remarkable political experiment of the medieval world, creating governmental structures that prefigure modern democratic institutions by several centuries. The Althing, established in 930 at Thingvellir, represents more than parliamentary innovation. It embodies a comprehensive reimagining of political authority that derives legitimacy from popular consent rather than hereditary privilege or divine mandate. The dramatic landscape of the parliamentary site, where continental plates literally pull apart beneath the feet of assembling legislators, provides geological metaphor for the political innovations taking place above ground. The legal traditions codified in Iceland during this period demonstrate sophisticated understanding of jurisprudential principles that anticipate later European constitutional development. The concept of legal equality among free men, the principle that authority derives from community consent, the mechanism of legal appeal through structured judicial procedures. These innovations emerge from practical necessity in a society that lacks traditional hierarchical structures but maintains complex social and economic relationships requiring systematic regulation. The preservation of these legal traditions in written form creates constitutional documents that influence European legal development for centuries. The literary achievements of this period transform oral tradition into written masterpieces that preserve not merely historical events, but entire worldviews that would otherwise disappear beneath the advancing tide of Christian conversion. The Saga tradition that flourishes in Iceland represents more than entertainment. It embodies sophisticated historical methodology that preserves accurate genealogical information, detailed geographic knowledge, and complex psychological insights within narrative frameworks that remain accessible to non-literate audiences. The preservation of these stories in written form creates a literature that rivals classical achievements in scope, complexity, and artistic sophistication. The religious transformations of this period reflect the creative tension between traditional Norse cosmology and expanding Christian influence. The conversion of Iceland around 1000 represents not simple replacement of one belief system with another, but complex synthesis that preserves essential elements of traditional worldview within Christian theological frameworks. The preservation of mythological narratives, the continuation of traditional legal practices, and the maintenance of cultural institutions demonstrate remarkable adaptability that maintains essential cultural continuity while accommodating religious change. Leif Eriksson's voyage to Vinland represents the culmination of Viking navigational achievement, extending European presence to the North American continent 5 centuries before Columbus. The expeditions to Newfoundland, documented in both archaeological evidence and saga narratives, demonstrate technological sophistication and geographic knowledge that enable oceanic voyages of unprecedented ambition. The temporary settlements established in Vinland, though ultimately abandoned, prove European capability for transoceanic colonization using medieval technology and organizational methods. The commercial networks that develop during this period create economic relationships of remarkable geographic scope and cultural diversity. Greenlandic walrus ivory reaches Egyptian markets through Byzantine commercial networks, while Arctic furs appear in Constantinopolitan luxury markets alongside silk from China and spices from India. The Viking trade routes connect regions previously isolated by geographic barriers, creating economic integration that prefigures later developments in global commerce. The merchants who manage these networks become cultural intermediaries who facilitate not merely economic exchange, but transmission of technologies, artistic styles, and intellectual traditions across vast distances. The height of Viking urban development during this period produces cities that rival any contemporary European achievements in scale, sophistication, and cosmopolitan character. Dublin, York, and Kiev become major commercial and administrative centres whose populations include not merely Scandinavian settlers, but diverse ethnic communities attracted by economic opportunities and cultural dynamism. These cities develop distinctive architectural styles, artistic traditions, and governmental institutions that blend Nordic, Celtic, Slavic, and Mediterranean influences into synthesis achievements that transcend simple cultural categories. The technological innovations of this period represent collective achievements that demonstrate systematic scientific methodology applied to practical challenges. The development of specialized navigational techniques for Arctic conditions, including the use of polarized crystals for solar observation during cloudy conditions, enables oceanic voyages that push beyond previously known geographic boundaries. The refinement of shipbuilding techniques produces vessels capable of both oceanic exploration and river navigation, maximizing operational flexibility in diverse aquatic environments. The artistic achievements of this period reveal cultural confidence and creative sophistication that challenge stereotypes of Viking barbarism. The metalwork, stone carving, and textile production of this era demonstrate technical mastery and aesthetic sophistication that rivals contemporary European achievements. The development of distinctive decorative styles that blend Scandinavian geometric traditions with influences absorbed through contact with Celtic, Slavic, and Byzantine artistic traditions produces hybrid forms that influence European artistic development for centuries. The political achievements of this period demonstrate Viking capacity for governmental innovation that anticipates later European constitutional developments. The creation of new forms of urban governance in Dublin and York, the development of legal traditions that blend different cultural practices in the Danelaw, and the establishment of democratic institutions in Iceland represent experiments in political organization that will influence European constitutional development for centuries. As the 10th century reaches its conclusion, Viking civilization has achieved geographic expansion, political innovation, commercial integration, and cultural synthesis that represents one of the great achievements of medieval European civilization. The foundations have been established for continued development that will test the limits of human adaptability and demonstrate the creative potential inherent in the collision between different cultural traditions. The great age of Viking expansion encounters its natural limits as the medieval world develops sophisticated countermeasures that neutralize the advantages that had made Norse raids devastatingly effective. The defensive innovations pioneered by Alfred the Great's successors create military systems specifically designed to resist seaborne assault, transforming the strategic environment that had enabled Viking success. The construction of fortified towns throughout England, the maintenance of standing armies capable of rapid response to maritime threats, and the development of naval forces that can contest Viking control of coastal waters represents systematic adaptation that eliminates the element of surprise that had been crucial to Norse tactical success. The Norman conquest of 1066 presents the ultimate historical irony. Vikings defeated by Vikings who had become French through cultural transformation that demonstrates the assimilative power of continental European civilization. William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings represents not merely military triumph, but the culmination of processes that had transformed Norse settlers in Normandy into something recognizably different from their Scandinavian ancestors. The Norman synthesis of Viking military effectiveness with Frankish governmental sophistication and Christian religious devotion creates hybrid civilization that surpasses its component parts in organizational capability and cultural achievement. Harold Hardrada's defeat at Stamford Bridge represents more than tactical failure. It symbolizes the end of an era when Scandinavian military superiority could determine the fate of European kingdoms. The Norwegian king's death in battle against Harold Godwinson's English forces demonstrates that the technological and organizational advantages that had enabled Viking expansion no longer provide decisive military supreme. AC. The failure of this final great Viking invasion of England marks the transition from an age of Nordic expansion to an era of European consolidation and institutional development. The Christianization of Scandinavia represents fundamental cultural transformation that redirects the energies that had driven expansion toward new forms of religious and political expression. The conversion of Denmark under Harald Bluetooth, Norway under Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf the Holy, and Sweden under Olof Skirtkonung creates Christian kingdoms that maintain political independence while accepting religious integration with broader European civilization. The transformation of warrior culture through Christian influence channels aggressive impulses toward new objectives, the Crusades, monastic foundation, cathedral construction, that demonstrate cultural adaptation rather than simple replacement. The emergence of the Crusades provides alternative outlets for the military energies that had previously driven Viking raids and expansion. The Northern Crusades, directed against pagan populations in the Baltic region, enable Scandinavian warriors to maintain traditional military practices while serving Christian religious objectives. The participation of Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish forces in these campaigns represents successful redirection of aggressive impulses toward purposes that strengthen rather than threaten European Christian civilization. The political consolidation that characterizes this period transforms Scandinavian political geography from a collection of competing tribal groups into centralized kingdoms capable of participating in European diplomatic and military systems. The unification of Denmark under the Jelling dynasty, the emergence of Norwegian royal authority under the House of Fairhair, and the gradual consolidation of Swedish territory under the House of Munso create political entities that can negotiate as equals with other European powers while maintaining distinctive cultural characteristics that derive from their Viking heritage. The technological changes that occur during this period eliminate many of the advantages that had enabled Viking military and commercial success. The development of improved fortification techniques reduces the effectiveness of surprise assault, while advances in naval architecture enable other European powers to contest Scandinavian maritime supremacy. The growth of overland trade routes diminishes the relative importance of riverine and coastal commercial networks that had been crucial to Viking economic strategy. The economic transformations of this period reflect broader European developments that make traditional Viking strategies less profitable and more dangerous. The growth of towns throughout Europe creates new forms of wealth that are less vulnerable to raid-based extraction, while the development of more sophisticated governmental institutions enables more effective resistance to external threats. The emergence of new forms of commercial organization, merchant guilds, urban corporations, international trading companies, creates economic opportunities that provide alternatives to traditional raiding and trading activities. The cultural synthesis that emerges from this period of transformation demonstrates remarkable continuity despite fundamental changes in political and religious orientation. The preservation of traditional legal practices within Christian institutional frameworks, the continuation of democratic participation through adapted governmental structures, and the maintenance of cultural traditions through literary preservation create hybrid civilizations that maintain essential elements of Viking heritage while participating in broader European cultural developments. The legal traditions that develop during this period represent successful synthesis of Scandinavian customary law with Roman legal principles transmitted through Christian institutional channels. The codification of national law codes in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden creates legal systems that maintain traditional concepts of individual rights and community participation while incorporating Christian theological principles and continental European jurisprudential innovations. The architectural achievements of this period demonstrate successful adaptation of Scandinavian building traditions to Christian religious requirements. The stave churches that emerged throughout Norway represent distinctive synthesis of traditional woodworking techniques with Christian liturgical needs, creating architectural forms that maintain cultural continuity while serving new religious purposes. The development of stone church architecture in Denmark and Sweden demonstrates similar synthetic achievements that blend Scandinavian aesthetic traditions with continental European architectural innovations. The literary productions of this period preserve traditional cultural materials while adapting them to new religious and political contexts. The preservation of mythological narratives within Christian historical frameworks, the adaptation of traditional poetic forms to Christian theological content, and the continuation of Saga traditions that incorporate Christian moral perspectives demonstrate remarkable cultural flexibility that maintains essential continuity despite fundamental ideological transformation. The demographic changes that occur during this period reflect broader European population movements that reduce the relative importance of Scandinavian communities within European civilization. The growth of population throughout continental Europe, the expansion of agricultural production through technological innovation, and the development of urban centers that attract population from rural areas create demographic dynamics that diminish the impact of Scandinavian population movements on broader European development. As the 11th century draws to its close, the Viking Age has evolved into something recognizably different from its origins in 8th century raids against defenseless monasteries. The transformation of Scandinavian societies from expansion-oriented tribes into settled Christian kingdoms represents successful adaptation to changing European conditions while maintaining essential elements of cultural heritage that will continue to influence European development for centuries to come. The consolidation of Scandinavian kingdoms during this transformative century marks the evolution of Viking culture from expansionist force into settled medieval civilization, Yet this transition preserves, rather than abandons, the essential innovations that had made Norse society distinctive within European development. The emergence of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden as recognizable medieval states represents not the death of Viking culture, but its maturation into forms capable of sustaining the democratic traditions, legal innovations, and cultural achievements that had emerged during the Age of Expansion. The transformation of political structures throughout Scandinavia demonstrates remarkable continuity despite fundamental changes in scale and institutional complexity. The development of royal administration in all three kingdoms maintains traditional concepts of limited monarchy and popular participation that derive directly from Thing assembly traditions. The codification of national law codes preserves customary legal principles while adapting them to the requirements of territorial states that must maintain diplomatic relationships with other European powers and administer diverse populations that include both traditional Scandinavian communities and assimilated foreign populations. The architectural achievements of this period reveal successful synthesis of traditional building techniques with new religious and political requirements. The great stone churches that emerged throughout Scandinavia demonstrate sophisticated engineering capability while maintaining aesthetic principles that derive from traditional woodworking traditions. The development of royal palaces and administrative centers creates secular architecture that blends continental European influences with distinctively Scandinavian design principles, producing hybrid forms that reflect successful cultural adaptation rather than simple imitation of foreign models. Iceland emerges during this period as the primary repository of Viking cultural memory, its geographic isolation enabling the preservation of traditions that undergo transformation elsewhere through political consolidation and religious conversion. The literary renaissance that flourishes in 12th and 13th century Iceland represents one of the great achievements of medieval European culture, creating written works that preserve not merely historical information, but entire worldviews that would otherwise disappear beneath the advancing tide of cultural homogenization. The Saga tradition that reaches its full development during this period demonstrates sophisticated historical methodology that anticipates later European scholarly achievements. The family sagas preserve accurate genealogical information across multiple generations, while maintaining detailed geographic knowledge that enables modern archaeological investigation. The king's sagas provide historical narratives that blend mythological understanding with factual accuracy, creating historical literature that rivals classical achievements in scope and sophistication while maintaining accessibility to non-scholarly audiences. The preservation of Norse mythology through Snorri Sturluson's literary efforts represents crucial cultural achievement that maintains traditional cosmological understanding within Christian intellectual frameworks. The Prose Edda creates systematic presentation of mythological narratives that preserves theological content while adapting it to contemporary literary tastes and religious sensibilities. This achievement demonstrates remarkable intellectual sophistication that manages to maintain traditional cultural content while making it acceptable to Christian audiences that might otherwise suppress pagan materials as deities, nengrous or heretical. The legal innovations that emerge during this period represent successful synthesis of traditional Scandinavian democratic principles with the administrative requirements of territorial states. The development of representative institutions that enable popular participation in royal governance creates constitutional traditions that anticipate later European democratic developments by several centuries. The concept of limited monarchy, the principle of legal equality among free citizens, and the tradition of judicial independence represent political innovations that derive directly from Viking Age democratic traditions while adapting them to medieval governmental requirements. The commercial developments of this period demonstrate successful transition from raid-based economics to trade-based prosperity that maintains traditional Scandinavian commercial advantages while adapting them to changing European economic conditions. The participation of Scandinavian merchants in the Hanseatic League creates commercial relationships that extend traditional trading networks while providing access to new markets and technologies. The development of urban centres throughout Scandinavia creates economic opportunities that provide alternatives to traditional agricultural and maritime occupations while maintaining cultural continuity through the preservation of traditional crafts and artistic traditions. The religious transformations of this period reflect successful synthesis of Christian theology with traditional Scandinavian cultural values, creating distinctive forms of medieval Christianity that maintain cultural continuity while participating in broader European religious developments. The development of national churches that maintain independence from papal authority while accepting Christian doctrine creates religious institutions that reflect traditional concepts of community, autonomy, and democratic participation. The preservation of traditional moral values within Christian theological frameworks demonstrates cultural adaptation rather than simple replacement of indigenous traditions with foreign religious practices. The artistic achievements of this period represent continuation and development of traditional Scandinavian aesthetic principles within new institutional contexts. The development of distinctive ecclesiastical art that blends Christian iconographic content with traditional decorative motifs creates hybrid forms that maintain cultural continuity while serving new religious purposes. The continuation of traditional metalworking, wood carving, and textile production techniques within monastery and court workshops preserves traditional craftsmanship while adapting it to new aesthetic and functional requirements. The literary developments of this period extend beyond saga writing to include religious poetry, historical chronicles, and legal texts that demonstrate remarkable intellectual sophistication and cultural confidence. The adaptation of traditional poetic forms to Christian theological content creates religious literature that maintains aesthetic continuity with pre-Christian traditions while serving new spiritual purposes. The development of historical writing that incorporates critical analysis of sources and systematic chronological organization represents scholarly achievement that rivals contemporary European intellectual developments. The technological innovations of this period represent continued development of traditional Scandinavian expertise in metallurgy, shipbuilding, and agricultural techniques adapted to changing economic and political conditions. The improvement of agricultural productivity through better ploughing techniques and crop rotation enables population growth that supports urban development and commercial expansion. The continued excellence in shipbuilding creates vessels adapted to new commercial requirements while maintaining traditional navigational capabilities that enable continued participation in long-distance trading networks. The demographic stabilization that occurs during this period reflects successful adaptation to territorial statehood that maintains population levels adequate for political independence while avoiding the expansion pressures that had driven earlier Viking Age migrations. The development of inheritance systems that maintain family holdings while providing opportunities for younger sons creates social stability that supports political consolidation while maintaining traditional concepts of individual opportunity and social mobility. As the 12th century reaches its conclusion, Scandinavian civilization has successfully navigated the transition from expansion-oriented tribal societies to settled medieval kingdoms while preserving essential elements of Viking heritage that will continue to influence European development. The democratic traditions, legal innovations, commercial expertise, and cultural achievements that emerge from this period of consolidation represent the mature expression of capabilities that had first appeared during the Age of Expansion, demonstrating the creative potential inherent in successful cultural adaptation to changing historical circumstances. The preservation of Viking heritage enters a new phase as the medieval world gives way to early modern developments that threaten traditional cultural continuity, yet simultaneously create new opportunities for the transmission of Scandinavian achievements to broader European civilization. The written preservation of saga literature ensures that Viking Age narratives will survive the transition from oral to literary culture, creating permanent cultural monuments that will influence European imagination for centuries to come. The transformation of historical memory from living tradition to literary artifact represents both loss and preservation, the end of direct cultural transmission, but the beginning of systematic scholarly investigation that will reveal achievements invisible to contemporary observers. Archaeological discoveries of the modern era revolutionize understanding of Viking civilization, revealing technological sophistication, commercial networks, and cultural achievements that medieval chroniclers had either ignored or misrepresented. The excavation of Greenlandic settlements provides evidence of Arctic adaptation strategies that demonstrate remarkable environmental expertise, while the discovery of Viking artifacts in North American sites confirms Saga narratives that had been dismissed as mythological fantasy. The systematic investigation of Scandinavian sites reveals urban planning, architectural innovation, and artistic achievement that challenge traditional stereotypes of Viking primitivism. The scientific investigation of Viking Age materials through modern analytical techniques creates new forms of historical knowledge that transcend the limitations of literary sources. DNA analysis of Scandinavian populations reveals the extent of Viking expansion and intermarriage with foreign populations, demonstrating genetic influences that extend from Iceland to Russia and from Scotland to the Mediterranean. The isotopic analysis of skeletal remains provides information about diet, mobility, and geographic origins that enables reconstruction of individual life histories with unprecedented precision. The Romantic revival of the 18th and 19th centuries reinvents Viking imagery for nationalist purposes that often distort historical reality while creating powerful cultural symbols that influence modern political and artistic developments. The creation of mythological narratives that emphasize Viking barbarism and violence reflects contemporary European anxieties about industrialization and cultural change rather than accurate historical understanding. Yet these romanticized images become embedded in popular culture with such tenacity that they continue to influence contemporary perceptions of medieval Scandinavian civilization. The development of modern Scandinavian national identities draws selectively upon Viking heritage to create political narratives that emphasize democratic traditions, individual freedom, and cultural independence while downplaying aspects of Viking civilization that conflict with contemporary values. The construction of constitutional monarchies that maintain traditional concepts of limited royal authority and popular participation represents successful adaptation of medieval political innovations to modern governmental requirements, demonstrating continuity across more than a millennium of political development. The influence of Viking legal traditions upon modern Scandinavian political institutions creates constitutional systems that anticipate broader European democratic developments while maintaining distinctive characteristics that derive from medieval precedents. The concept of ombudsman institutions that provide independent oversight of governmental authority represents direct evolution from medieval legal traditions that emphasized individual rights and community participation in judicial processes. The development of welfare state institutions that emphasize collective responsibility for individual welfare reflects traditional Scandinavian concepts of community obligation and mutual support. The modern scholarly investigation of Viking civilization creates academic disciplines that transcend traditional boundaries between history, archaeology, linguistics, and anthropology. The development of medieval studies as systematic scholarly enterprise enables interdisciplinary investigation that reveals cultural achievements and historical influences that had been invisible to earlier generations of historians. The application of scientific methods to historical investigation creates new forms of knowledge that demonstrate the sophistication and complexity of medieval Scandinavian civilization. The popular cultural representation of Vikings in contemporary media creates global awareness of Scandinavian heritage, while often perpetuating stereotypes that obscure historical reality. The development of cinema, television, and digital entertainment that features Viking themes demonstrates continuing fascination with Nordic culture, while creating commercial incentives for the continued investigation and preservation of archaeological and literary materials. The global distribution of these cultural products ensures that Viking imagery becomes embedded in international popular culture, with influence that extends far beyond Scandinavian national boundaries. The preservation of saga literature through modern scholarly editing and translation creates international access to Viking Age literary achievements that enables comparative analysis with other medieval European traditions. The recognition of saga literature as major achievement of world literature ensures continued scholarly investigation and artistic inspiration that maintains cultural continuity across multiple generations of readers and writers. The influence of saga narrative techniques upon modern literary development demonstrates the continued relevance of medieval Scandinavian artistic achievements. The political influence of Scandinavian democratic traditions upon modern European and international institutional development creates constitutional principles that derive ultimately from Viking Age political innovations. The concept of international law that emphasizes negotiated resolution of conflicts rather than military domination reflects traditional Scandinavian diplomatic practices adapted to contemporary global conditions. The development of international institutions that emphasize consensus building and peaceful conflict resolution represents evolution of political principles that first appeared in medieval thing assemblies. The environmental knowledge preserved in Viking Age sources provides historical information about climate change, ecological adaptation, and sustainable resource management that remains relevant to contemporary environmental challenges. The Greenlandic settlements provide case studies in environmental adaptation and ultimate failure that offer insights into the relationship between human societies and environmental change. The preservation of traditional ecological knowledge through saga literature and archaeological investigation creates resources for contemporary environmental policy that demonstrate the continued practical relevance of Viking Age achievements. The genetic legacy of Viking expansion continues to influence contemporary population genetics throughout regions that experience Scandinavian settlement or commercial contact. The persistence of Scandinavian genetic markers in populations from Iceland to Russia demonstrates the demographic impact of medieval expansion while providing scientific evidence for historical narratives preserved in literary sources. The investigation of ancient DNA from archaeological sites enables reconstruction of population movements and cultural interactions that supplement and sometimes correct literary historical sources. The commercial innovations developed during the Viking Age continue to influence modern Scandinavian economic development through institutional traditions that emphasize international trade, technological innovation, and flexible adaptation to changing market conditions. The development of modern Scandinavian economic systems that balance free market principles with social welfare institutions reflects traditional concepts of community responsibility and individual opportunity that derive ultimately from Viking Age social structures. The artistic traditions that emerged from Viking cultural synthesis continue to influence modern Scandinavian design and artistic production through aesthetic principles that emphasize functional excellence, natural materials, and geometric sophistication. The development of modern Scandinavian design traditions that achieve international recognition demonstrates cultural continuity across more than a millennium of artistic development while adapting traditional principles to contemporary requirements and technologies. As the modern world grapples with challenges of globalization, environmental change, and cultural preservation, the Viking Age provides historical precedents for successful adaptation to changing conditions while maintaining essential cultural values and institutions. The demonstration that small populations can exercise influence far beyond their numerical significance offers inspiration for contemporary societies that seek to maintain cultural independence while participating in global economic and political systems. The Viking Age represents far more than a period of medieval European expansion. It embodies fundamental patterns of human adaptation, cultural synthesis, and historical transformation that transcend specific chronological boundaries to illuminate enduring aspects of human civilization. The deeper significance of this remarkable historical epoch lies not in its dramatic moments of conquest and exploration, but in its demonstration of humanity's capacity for reinvention, its ability to transform environmental challenges into opportunities for creative development, and its endless potential for cultural synthesis that produces achievements surpassing the sum of their component parts. The paradox of destruction and creation that characterizes Viking expansion reveals the complex relationship between violence and cultural development that appears throughout human history. The raids that brought terror to medieval monasteries simultaneously created commercial networks that enriched European civilization, while the conquests that destroyed existing political structures enabled the development of new forms of governance that anticipated modern democratic institutions. This apparent contradiction reflects deeper truths about historical change that rarely proceeds through peaceful evolution alone, but requires the creative destruction that enables new forms of human organization to emerge from the limitations of existing systems. The theme of transformation that runs throughout Viking civilization demonstrates remarkable human adaptability that enables societies to reinvent themselves repeatedly in response to changing environmental, economic, and political conditions. The same peoples who begin as subsistence farmers in Scandinavian fjords evolve into international merchants, urban administrators, and constitutional innovators who influence European development for centuries. Is transformation occurs not through abandonment of traditional values, but through creative adaptation that preserves essential cultural principles while expressing them in new institutional forms appropriate to changing circumstances. The importance of storytelling in Viking culture reveals the crucial role of narrative in maintaining cultural continuity across geographic dispersion and temporal change. The Saga tradition that preserves Viking heritage demonstrates how human societies maintain identity through shared narratives that transmit values, preserve knowledge, and create meaning that transcends immediate material circumstances. The continued influence of Viking stories in contemporary culture demonstrates the power of narrative to create cultural immortality that survives long after the political and economic systems that produced these stories have disappeared. The cyclical nature of historical development that appears in Viking civilization reflects broader patterns of expansion, consolidation, and cultural evolution that characterize human societies throughout history. The movement from tribal organization to territorial statehood that occurs in Scandinavian development parallels similar transitions in other European societies while maintaining distinctive characteristics that derive from specific environmental and cultural conditions. This process demonstrates how human societies balance universal developmental pressures with particular cultural inheritances to create unique syntheses that contribute to the diversity of human civilization. The democratic innovations that emerge from Viking political traditions demonstrate the capacity of human societies to develop institutional solutions to collective problems that anticipate much later political developments. The Thing assemblies that governed Viking Age communities created precedents for representative government, constitutional limitation of royal authority, and judicial independence that would not appear elsewhere in Europe for several centuries. This precocious political development reflects environmental and cultural conditions that encouraged democratic participation, while demonstrating the human capacity for institutional innovation that transcends immediate material constraints. The commercial achievements of Viking civilization reveal the importance of cultural flexibility and technological adaptation in enabling human societies to exploit economic opportunities that require geographic mobility and cultural synthesis. The trading networks that connected Arctic regions to Mediterranean markets demonstrated remarkable organizational capability and cultural adaptability that enabled small populations to exercise economic influence far beyond their numerical significance. This achievement reflects broader human capacities for creating complex cooperative systems that enable individuals and communities to achieve objectives impossible through isolated effort. The environmental knowledge preserved in Viking sources demonstrates sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships and adaptation strategies that remain relevant to contemporary environmental challenges. The Greenlandic settlements provide case studies in both successful adaptation and ultimate failure that offer insights into the complex relationships between human societies and environmental change. The preservation of traditional ecological knowledge through literary and archaeological sources creates resources for understanding long-term environmental processes that supplement scientific investigation with historical perspective. The artistic achievements of Viking civilization demonstrate the human capacity for creating beauty and meaning under conditions of material limitation and social stress. The sophisticated metalwork, architectural innovation, and literary production that emerged from Viking society reveal cultural values that prioritized artistic achievement, despite practical pressures that might be expected to focus exclusively upon survival and expansion. This artistic production demonstrates the human need for creative expression that transcends immediate material requirements to create lasting cultural achievements. The religious transformations that occur within Viking civilization reveal the complex processes through which human societies adapt traditional spiritual understanding to changing cultural and political conditions. The synthesis of Norse mythology with Christian theology that characterizes later Viking development demonstrates remarkable cultural flexibility that preserves essential spiritual insights while adapting them to new institutional contexts. This religious evolution reflects broader human capacities for maintaining spiritual continuity while adapting to fundamental changes in cosmological understanding. The genetic legacy of Viking expansion provides biological evidence for cultural processes that enabled small populations to influence much larger genetic pools through successful cultural adaptation and intermarriage. The persistence of Scandinavian genetic markers throughout regions of Viking settlement demonstrates demographic impact that supplements literary and archaeological evidence while providing scientific confirmation for historical narratives preserved in traditional sources. This genetic evidence reveals the biological dimensions of cultural exchange that create lasting connections between human populations across vast geographic distances. The continuing influence of Viking civilization upon contemporary political, economic, and cultural development demonstrates the power of successful institutional innovation to influence human development across multiple centuries. The democratic traditions, commercial practices, and cultural values that emerge from Viking society continue to shape modern Scandinavian institutions, while influencing broader European and international development through processes of cultural transmission that operate across vast temporal distances. The ultimate significance of the Viking Age lies not in any single achievement, but in its demonstration of human potential for creative adaptation to changing circumstances, while maintaining essential cultural values that provide meaning and identity across generations of historical change. The Vikings succeeded not because they abandoned their traditional heritage, but because they discovered ways to express fundamental cultural principles through new institutional forms that proved adaptable to diverse geographic and political environments. The mirror that Viking civilization holds up to contemporary human societies reflects both inspiring possibilities and sobering limitations that characterize all human cultural achievements. The capacity for expansion and adaptation that enabled Viking success also contained the seeds of transformation that eventually produced societies recognizably different from their origins. This pattern reflects universal human experiences of growth, change, and adaptation that create both opportunities and challenges for societies seeking to maintain cultural continuity while responding to changing historical circumstances. The human cost of Viking expansion must be acknowledged alongside its achievements, recognizing that cultural synthesis often emerges from processes that impose suffering upon individuals and communities that become unwilling participants in historical transformation. The slaves transported across Viking trading networks, the communities destroyed by Viking raids, and the populations displaced by Viking settlement represent the price paid for achievements that enriched human civilization while exacting terrible costs from those who bore the immediate burden of historical change. The enduring fascination with Viking civilization reflects deeper human needs for narratives that celebrate courage, exploration, and cultural achievement while acknowledging the complex moral dimensions of historical development. The Vikings embodied contradictions that characterize all human societies: the capacity for both creation and destruction, the ability to achieve remarkable cultural synthesis while imposing terrible costs upon others, the power to create lasting institutions while remaining subject to historical forces beyond their control. The cyclical nature of historical development that appears in Viking civilization suggests that human societies must continually adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining essential cultural principles that provide continuity across generations of change. The challenge faced by the Vikings, how to preserve essential cultural values while adapting to new environmental and political conditions, remains relevant to contemporary societies grappling with globalization, technological change, and environmental challenges that require fundamental adaptations without abandoning essential human values. The Viking Age concludes not with dramatic finality, but with gradual transformation that demonstrates the resilience of human cultural achievements and their capacity to influence future development through processes of adaptation and synthesis that create continuity across apparent discontinuity. The transformation of Viking society into medieval Scandinavian kingdoms represents successful cultural evolution that preserved essential achievements while adapting them to changing historical circumstances. The deeper currents that drove Viking expansion continue to flow through human history in forms adapted to contemporary conditions: the drive to explore beyond known boundaries, the capacity for cultural synthesis that creates new forms of human organization, the democratic impulse that seeks to balance individual freedom with collective responsibility, and the creative tension between tradition and innovation that enables societies to maintain identity while adapting to change. The eternal saga that preserves Viking memory operates not merely through literary transmission, but through the continued influence of institutional innovations, cultural values, and historical examples that demonstrate human potential for achievement under challenging circumstances. The Vikings live on not as museum pieces, but as active influences upon contemporary development, their achievements continuing to inspire and challenge human societies, seeking to balance expansion with sustainability, innovation with tradition, individual achievement with collective responsibility. As the final waves of this ancient storm settle into the peaceful rhythms of historical memory, they carry within them the enduring message that human societies possess remarkable capacities for adaptation, achievement, and cultural synthesis that enable small populations to exercise influence far beyond their numerical significance. The Viking Age demonstrates that historical significance derives not from size or duration, but from the quality of human achievement and the lasting influence of successful institutional innovation upon subsequent human development. The dragon ships that once carried Viking warriors beyond the edge of the known world have long since returned to the elements from which they were crafted, their oak timbers becoming soil that nourishes new growth, their iron nails rusting into earth that supports his new life. Yet the voyages they enabled continue in different forms: in the democratic institutions that preserve Viking political innovations, in the commercial networks that extend Viking trading achievements, in the cultural synthesis that demonstrates Viking adaptability, and in the human imagination that finds continued inspiration in stories of courage, exploration, and cultural achievement that transcend the specific historical circumstances that created them. The Viking Age ends where it began, with the sound of water against shore, the rhythm of human activity that adapts to natural forces while transforming them to human purposes, the eternal human drive to explore beyond known boundaries while creating meaning and community that provide continuity across the vast expanses of time and space that separate individual lives from the larger patterns of historical development. The saga continues, not in the clash of shields or the crash of waves against dragon-headed prows, but in the quiet persistence of human memory and the enduring power of stories that capture something essential about the human spirit and its capacity for achievement, adaptation, and hope in the face of challenges that test the limits of human possibility. In this continuing saga, the Vikings represent not a completed chapter, but an ongoing inspiration, a demonstration that human societies can transcend their apparent limitations through courage, creativity, and cultural synthesis that enables achievement far beyond what isolated individuals or communities might accomplish alone. Their legacy lives on in every democratic institution that honors individual rights while maintaining collective responsibility, in every commercial network that connects distant communities through mutually beneficial exchange, in every cultural synthesis that creates new forms of human achievement from the creative collision of different traditions, and in every exploration that pushes beyond known boundaries to discover new possibilities for human development and fulfillment.